Jax's revenge domain. Outstanding work on this turnaround strategy, Brandon. Your vision just saved our entire operation. I watched Plant Director Jessica Morgan clasp my colleague's shoulder like they were celebrating the deal of the century. The handshake went on way too long, her smile too wide. Brandon leaned back in that conference chair with this relaxed confidence that made my jaw tighten. 12 people in that executive meeting room. Every single one of them looking at him like he'd just pulled our automotive parts plant back from the brink of closure. And maybe he had, if you asked him. If you asked anyone in that moment. But I knew different. My name is Steve Patterson. I'm 48 years old. And that was the day I stopped letting other people take credit for my work. 4 months. That's how long I'd spent rebuilding their production efficiency model from scratch. 4 months of 12-hour days while Brandon left every Friday at 3 for his networking events. 4 months of running lean manufacturing calculations until my brain felt fried, of finding the bottlenecks in our assembly process that were bleeding money faster than anyone wanted to admit, of mapping out a step-by-step approach to stop the waste and actually turn our numbers around. The data was mine. Every single calculation, the workflow optimizations showing which stations to eliminate and which to upgrade, all mine. The equipment maintenance schedules that would save us from another catastrophic breakdown, mine. The risk analysis that identified which suppliers were causing delays, mine. I'd even color-coded the implementation timeline so the executives could follow along without getting lost in the technical details. Brandon had contributed exactly 2 things, his MBA vocabulary and his ability to show up on time to meetings. Thank you, Jessica. I really appreciate the recognition, Brandon said. His voice had this humble quality, like he was trying not to brag but couldn't help feeling proud. I waited 5 seconds. 10. 15. He didn't mention my name. Didn't even glance in my direction. Jessica moved on to the next agenda item, still talking about Brandon's innovative thinking. Someone else chimed in about his strategic vision. Another executive mentioned how impressive it was that he'd identified inefficiencies their entire leadership team had missed. Brandon just nodded along, soaking up praise for work he couldn't have done if someone handed him a wrench and pointed him toward the assembly line. I sat there watching this whole thing unfold, like I was outside my own body. The meeting wrapped up. People started gathering their things, shaking hands, making small talk about weekend plans and the upcoming holiday shutdown. Brandon stood up, adjusting his tie, chatting with one of the VPs about some industry conference he'd be attending. I reached up and unclipped my company badge. The plastic was warm from being against my shirt for the last 3 hours. I set it down on the conference table right between the coffee, cups someone had forgotten to clear, and the stack of printed reports I'd prepared. Then I stood up. I'm done here. Effective immediately. The room didn't go silent. That's not what happened. But people stopped mid-sentence. The VP Brandon was talking to looked over at me with this confused expression like I'd started speaking another language. Jessica took a step toward me. What are you talking about, Steve? I'm resigning right now. I'll send you something in writing by end of day, but consider this my official notice. Brandon finally looked at me, really looked, and I saw it there in his expression, this flicker of panic he tried to cover up real quick. Let's talk about this outside, Jessica said, already moving toward the door. There's nothing to talk about. I walked out, just turned and left while they all stood there trying to figure out what had just happened. I didn't storm out, didn't make a scene, just walked at normal pace through the plant floor, past the assembly stations. I'd spent months analyzing, past the operators who'd gotten used to seeing me with my stopwatch and clipboard, got in my truck and drove home. Jessica started calling within 30 minutes. Then the calls turned into texts. I let the first few go to voicemail, but by the 15th attempt, I picked up just to make it stop. You're overreacting, she said. No hello, no asking if I was okay, just straight into telling me I was wrong. Brandon was just accepting praise for the team. That's what project leads do. Project leads, I repeated. Brandon's a project lead now? You know what I mean. He was representing the work you both did. Both did. Jessica, tell me one thing Brandon contributed to that turnaround plan besides spell-checking the cover page. Silence long enough, I thought the connection dropped. It's more complicated than that, she finally said. Brandon has relationships with corporate. They trust his presentations. That matters in these situations, so I do the work and he gets the applause because people like his PowerPoint skills better? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? More silence. Then, sleep on it. Don't make any rash decisions. We can figure this out Monday. I hung up. Here's what nobody tells you about quitting in a moment like that. The rest of your day feels strange. I went home and sat in my garage for an hour, not working on anything, just sitting there thinking about every other time something like this had happened. Smaller versions of it. Brandon taking my process improvements in team meetings and rephrasing them like they'd just occurred to him. Brandon's name appearing first on efficiency reports I'd written 90% of. Brandon getting invited to corporate strategy sessions while I stayed late troubleshooting equipment failures that had both our signatures on the maintenance logs. The pattern had been building for months, maybe years. I'd been telling myself it didn't matter, that the work spoke for itself, that eventually people would notice who was actually producing results. But they hadn't noticed. They just kept promoting Brandon. I thought about the time I'd developed a new preventive maintenance schedule that reduced downtime by 15%. Brandon had presented it to the regional managers as our team's innovation. I thought about the supplier evaluation process I'd created that saved us $200,000 in the first quarter. Brandon had taken the lead in explaining it to corporate, never once mentioning that I'd spent 6 weeks analyzing vendor data. That weekend I updated my LinkedIn profile, not with some angry post about what happened. Nothing like that. Just quietly updated my experience, my certifications, the specific manufacturing improvements I'd implemented. I made sure every lean process optimization I'd developed was listed under my name with details about cost savings and efficiency gains. I added the automotive supplier network optimization that increased throughput by 22%. The assembly line reconfiguration that reduced material handling time by 40 minutes per shift. The quality control checkpoint system that cut defect rates from 3.2% to 0.8%. All documented with exact numbers, exact timelines, exact results. Monday morning, I woke up to 6 messages from people I'd never met. Plant managers at different automotive suppliers. Operations directors from manufacturing companies I'd heard of but never worked with. They'd seen my profile updates. They'd heard about the turnaround methodology I'd built, and they wanted to know if I was available to help with their struggling operations. At first, I thought maybe Jessica had sent them my way as some kind of peace offering. But when I talked to the first one, he mentioned he'd been trying to track me down for weeks after hearing about my work through industry contacts. "We've got a similar situation," he told me. A plant manager from Michigan, voice tired but hopeful. Plant that expanded too fast, hemorrhaging money on inefficient processes, equipment that's not talking to each other, operators working around problems instead of fixing them. "I heard you're the guy who knows how to fix this kind of thing." "Where did you hear that?" "People talk. Your methodology's been making the rounds in our supplier network. Everyone wants to know who built it. We're not looking for another consultant who's going to give us a fancy presentation and disappear. We need someone who understands how production actually works." Not Brandon's name, mine. The second call was from Ohio, a stamping plant that was losing money on every part they produced. The third was from Tennessee, an assembly operation that couldn't figure out why their cycle times kept increasing even with new equipment. By Wednesday, I had 8 different automotive suppliers asking me to consult on their failing operations. They didn't want someone to just patch problems. They wanted someone who could look at a broken production line and rebuild it from the ground up. That was my specialty, the thing I'd gotten good at over 22 years of actually working on plant floors, not just reading about them in business school. I started saying yes. 1 project at first, then 2 at once, then 5. The work was intense, but in a different way than before. Instead of spending months on a single plant while someone else got celebrated for it, I was spending 3-4 weeks on each one, getting paid what I should have been making in 6 months, and getting thanked by the actual decision makers who knew exactly who'd done the work. The Michigan plant was bleeding $50,000 a month on material waste. I spent 2 weeks mapping their workflow, identified 3 bottlenecks that were causing ripple effects throughout the entire operation, fixed it with equipment repositioning and operator retraining that cost them $12,000 and saved them $45,000 monthly. The plant manager shook my hand and said it was the best money they'd ever spent. The Ohio stamping operation was running at 60% efficiency because nobody had bothered to optimize their die changeover process. I redesigned their setup procedures, reduced changeover time from 90 minutes to 35 minutes. Their productivity jumped 25% in the first month. Jessica kept trying to reach me, less frequently as the weeks went on, but still she'd send messages asking if I'd reconsider, saying they really needed me back. that things weren't running as smoothly without me. The efficiency numbers I'd projected weren't materializing. The implementation was falling behind schedule. I didn't respond. Brandon tried exactly once. A single text that said, "Hope there's no hard feelings. You're really talented, and I'm sure you'll do great things." I stared at that message for a long time. 22 years of experience reduced to really talented. Like I was some promising junior engineer he was encouraging. I blocked his number. But here's what Brandon didn't understand. What none of them understood. I wasn't angry anymore. I was grateful. Getting forced out was the best thing that could have happened to me. I'd been playing their game, hoping someone would notice my work, waiting for recognition that was never going to come. Now I was playing my own game. 7 weeks after I walked out of that executive meeting, my situation had completely changed. I was working with 15 different manufacturing operations, making more money than I'd thought possible, getting recognized by name when I walked into plants. People listened when I talked. Nobody interrupted me to rephrase what I just said. Nobody's name appeared on my work except mine. I had business cards that said Steve Patterson, Manufacturing Efficiency Consultant, my own letterhead, my own contracts, my own rates. When plant managers called me, they weren't calling Brandon's assistant or going through Jessica's approval process. They were calling me directly because they'd heard my name specifically mentioned by other plant managers who'd seen results. And then Jessica's name showed up on my phone again. Different time this time, late evening on a Wednesday. I almost didn't pick up, but something made me curious. Maybe it was the timing. Plant managers don't call at 8 p.m. unless something's really wrong. "We need help." Her voice sounded strained, tired. "The efficiency numbers are getting worse. Corporate wants you back. Name your price." I let that sit in the air for a moment. Imagined her in her office, probably stressed, probably desperate, probably getting pressure from above about why the turnaround strategy wasn't working. What happened to your brilliant strategist? The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. He couldn't replicate the results. Replicate? That's an interesting word choice. Steve, listen, I know how this looks. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Brandon took applause for work he couldn't actually execute. And now you're in trouble because you believed him. Corporate is asking questions. They want to know why the implementation isn't matching the projections. They're asking specifically for you, by name. Of course they are. Because executives aren't stupid. They can tell the difference between someone who understands manufacturing and someone who's just presenting charts. The efficiency gains we projected aren't happening. The cost savings you calculated, they're not materializing. Equipment downtime is actually getting worse, not better. Because he didn't create it, I said. That's why he couldn't replicate the results. You can't execute something you never understood in the first place. Jessica made this sound, half sigh, half groan. Please. We're hemorrhaging money. The corporate team is panicking. I'm being told to fix this or they're replacing me. The board wants answers. Your methodology was supposed to save us. But without you here to implement it, it's falling apart. My methodology is fine. Your execution is the problem. Then come back and execute it. Whatever you want, whatever it takes. I sat down in my home office, phone pressed to my ear, thinking about all those times I'd watched Brandon get praised for my work. All those times I'd swallowed my frustration and told myself to just keep my head down and produce good results. All those times I'd convinced myself that eventually someone would notice who was actually doing the work. But this was different. This wasn't about recognition anymore. This was about leverage. "I'll consult," I said, "but I'm not coming back as an employee. I work for myself now. Fine, whatever. Name your terms." $180 per hour, and that's the consulting rate, not annual salary. You're paying me what I'm worth now, not what you decided I was worth before. I heard her breathe out. Quick calculation in her head. 180 times 40 hours times however many weeks this would take. Probably more than they'd paid me in 6 months of salary. Done. Anything else? Yeah. I present directly to corporate and plant leadership. No intermediaries, no managers filtering my recommendations, just me explaining my work to the people making the decisions. Of course. Absolutely. And Brandon sits in that room while I do it. Silence. Long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Jessica, did you hear me?" "I heard you. I just don't understand why that's necessary." "Because I want him to watch while I explain every single thing he claimed as his own. every process improvement he took credit for, every calculation he couldn't reproduce. I want him to sit there while the same people who praised him realize exactly what happened. That's the condition. Take it or I hang up and you can figure this out yourself. More silence. Then, I'll make it happen. We set the meeting for 2 weeks out. That gave me time to finish up my current projects and prepare for what was coming. Those 2 weeks felt longer than the previous 7 combined. I kept working with my other clients, kept building my reputation, but part of my brain was already planning what I'd say in that room. I spent those 2 weeks documenting everything, not just the final strategy, but my entire process. The initial plant walkthrough where I'd identified the bottlenecks, the time studies I'd conducted on each assembly station, the supplier analysis that revealed which vendors were causing delays, the maintenance schedules I'd developed, the training protocols I'd written, every email I'd sent, every revision I'd made, every late night I'd spent running calculations while Brandon was at his networking events. I had timestamps, version histories, documented conversations, a complete record of who had actually done the work. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves, from anticipation. I lay there in the dark thinking about Brandon's face when corporate had praised him. That relaxed confidence, that easy acceptance of recognition he hadn't earned. Tomorrow, that was going to change. I showed up 20 minutes early. The plant looked the same as it had 2 months ago, but walking into it felt completely different. Last time I'd been an employee hoping someone would notice my work. This time, I was a hired expert. They were paying premium rates to fix their disaster. Jessica met me at security. She looked worse than she'd sounded on the phone. Dark circles under her eyes, suit not as pressed as usual. The kind of tired that comes from weeks of explaining to corporate why your numbers don't match your projections. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Corporate's already here. They flew in specifically for this. They're very eager to hear from you." "Is Brandon here?" "He's here. I told him he needed to attend as part of the transition briefing. He didn't have much choice." We walked through the plant toward the main conference room. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. I passed the assembly stations I'd analyzed, the equipment I'd recommended moving, the workstations, where I'd spent hours timing operations. I wasn't wearing the same clothes as last time. I'd chosen something sharper, more expensive. The kind of outfit that said I wasn't asking for permission anymore. The room was full when we entered. 14 people, but different faces this time. The full corporate team had flown in from Detroit. Senior plant leadership I recognized from my employee days. Regional operations managers who'd probably heard about the efficiency problems from multiple plants. And Brandon, sitting near the back, looking like he wished he could disappear into the wall. Our eyes met for half a second. He looked away first. "Everyone, this is Steve Patterson," Jessica announced. "He'll be walking us through the efficiency optimization strategy and its implementation." Several executives nodded. One of them, the same corporate VP who'd been so impressed 2 months ago, stood up and shook my hand. "We've heard a lot about you," he said. "People in the industry speak very highly of your work. I appreciate that." Everyone found their seats. I moved to the front of the room, connected my laptop to the projector, and pulled up my presentation. 4 months of work plus 2 weeks of documentation, distilled into a format that would take 2 hours to properly explain. I didn't rush, didn't summarize. I was getting paid $180 an hour to be here. They were going to get every minute of value. I walked them through every single part of it. Started with the initial assessment, how I'd identified which processes were draining resources without adding value. Showed them the time motion studies I'd run on their assembly workflow, the specific bottlenecks where decisions had been made without adequate data. Explained exactly how I'd rebuilt their efficiency model from the ground up. "This section here," I said, pointing to a particularly complex workflow diagram, required understanding the interdependencies between 3 different assembly stations. I spent 2 weeks just mapping material flow, because one mistake here would have meant production delays worth thousands per hour. One of the corporate executives leaned forward. "Brandon, did you work on this analysis?" I didn't look at Brandon. Kept my focus on the executive. I developed this analysis independently. It required specific knowledge of lean manufacturing principles and hands-on production experience. Brandon stayed quiet. I moved to the next section. The equipment optimization strategies. The station-by-station breakdown of where to reallocate resources and where to invest in automation. the implementation timeline that would minimize disruption while maximizing efficiency gains. The key insight here, I explained, was recognizing that the problem wasn't the equipment itself, it was the workflow sequencing. You had bottlenecks in stations 3 and 7 that were creating ripple effects throughout the entire line. That mismatch was killing your throughput. The same VP was taking notes now, really engaged, asking questions about specific data points. "How did you identify which stations had the longest cycle times?" he asked. "Direct observation and timing studies over 3 weeks, cross-referenced with production data and maintenance logs. Took about 60 hours of floor time, but once the pattern became clear, the solutions followed naturally." Another executive spoke up. "And the implementation plan. How confident are you that this will work?" "The methodology's sound. The issue you've been having is execution. This strategy requires someone who understands not just what to do, but why each step matters and how they connect. You can't follow it like a recipe. You have to understand the underlying manufacturing principles, which is why it wasn't working," one of the VPs said slowly, realization dawning. "We thought we could just follow the plan, but without understanding the engineering behind it. It falls apart the moment you hit an unexpected variable," I finished. "Which you did, multiple times." I glanced at Brandon then, just briefly. He was staring at his hands, jaw tight. The presentation continued for another hour. I answered every question, clarified every confusion, walked them through scenarios and contingencies and alternative approaches if certain assumptions proved wrong. By the end, the energy in the room had completely shifted. The executives who'd been skeptical were talking about moving forward. The plant leadership was asking about implementation schedules. "This is exceptional work," the lead VP said. "I have to ask, when we were here 2 months ago, we were told this was Brandon's strategy. Can you clarify how that collaboration worked?" The room got very still. I looked at Brandon, made sure everyone saw me looking at him. Then I turned back to the VP. "There was no collaboration. I built this strategy alone over 4 months. Brandon's contribution was attending the meeting where I presented it to you. You could feel the shift. Not dramatic, but people sat back differently, exchanged glances, reassessed everything they thought they knew." The VP who'd shaken Brandon's hand 2 months ago looked over at him. "Is that accurate?" Brandon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I mean, we worked as a team." "Answer the question," one of the executives said. "Did you develop this strategy?" The silence stretched out. Brandon's face had gone red, not from anger, from embarrassment, from being cornered in front of people whose respect he'd been borrowing without earning. "No," he finally said. "I didn't develop it." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the lead VP cleared his throat. "Brandon, I think we need to have a separate conversation about this." "We all do," another executive said. His tone wasn't angry, just matter of fact, like he was recalculating everything he'd thought he knew. "We made resource allocation decisions based on our assessment of your technical capabilities. If that assessment was inaccurate, we need to understand why." I spent the next 45 minutes outlining exactly what had to happen, which processes to optimize first, which equipment needed upgrading, how to retrain operators without disrupting production, what metrics to track daily versus weekly, who needed to be making which decisions. They listened, really listened, asked smart questions, took notes. Brandon sat there the entire time, not contributing, not speaking unless directly addressed, which he wasn't. When the meeting finally wrapped up, people came up to thank me individually, shook my hand, told me they were relieved to have me involved, asked when I could start the implementation. Brandon left without saying goodbye to anyone. Over the next 9 weeks, I worked with them on implementation, not as an employee, as an independent expert they were paying premium rates to access. I came in 3 times a week, met with operators and supervisors, checked progress, adjusted processes when real-world variables proved different than projected. The turnaround started showing results within 6 weeks. Efficiency numbers that had been declining for months started climbing. Corporate stopped asking questions and started asking about expanding the methodology to other plants. Brandon, meanwhile, got transferred to corporate planning, something to do with strategic forecasting where he couldn't claim ownership of operational improvements. I heard through people still working there that he'd requested a transfer to a different division within 5 months. But here's the thing. The satisfaction wasn't just in proving I was right. It was in building something that lasted beyond that confrontation. My consulting practice kept growing. The 15 plants became 23, then 31. Manufacturing operations started reaching out before they hit crisis mode, wanting preventive assessments, wanting someone to look at their processes before they committed resources to strategies that wouldn't work. 18 months after I walked out of that executive meeting, I was working with clients in 7 states, making more in a quarter than I'd made in a year at my old job, getting invited to speak at manufacturing conferences about lean optimization and efficiency turnarounds. People knew my name now. When I walked into plants, they knew exactly who I was and why I was there. And Brandon? Last I heard, he took a position at a smaller operation in a different state. Somewhere his reputation hadn't followed him. The industry's smaller than people think. Word gets around. Your work has to be undeniably yours. Looking back now, I realize that walking out that day wasn't just about Brandon stealing credit. It was about finally valuing myself enough to demand what I was worth. At 48, I learned something I should have figured out 20 years earlier. Nobody's going to fight for your recognition harder than you will. If you're reading this and you're in your 40s or 50s, thinking it's too late to start over, thinking you're stuck where you are, you're not. The skills you've spent decades building, the knowledge you've accumulated, the problems you know how to solve, those have value, real value. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to accept less than you're worth.